This is the story of John Salmon, a man who was accused in the death of his common-law wife, Maxine Ditchfield. John and Maxine met in 1967, started dating in 1970, and had recently moved in together in Woodstock, Ontario. Maxine was 28 years old and made her living as a dog groomer. She had 3 kids prior to meeting John, who was 30 at the time and worked as a welder. Maxine died of fatal brain injuries on September 22, 1970. 3 days prior to Maxine's death, she and John were visiting friends of theirs, the Claydons. They dropped the kids off at the Claydons' home, and the 2 couples went to a local hotel bar to have some drinks. They later returned to the Claydons' barn, where they continued to drink. At some point late in the evening, Maxine had fallen off of her chair. It was then that John helped her up off of the ground, and they decided to get the kids and go home. Maxine fell asleep in the car on the way home, and upon arrival, John left the front door unlocked so she could come inside whenever she woke up. He got the children, put them to bed, and he went to sleep. The following morning, John woke up and found Maxine in the children's bedroom. He helped her to get to the bathroom and noticed that her movements were weak and clumsy. He also noticed that she had a black eye. Due to the heavy drinking that occurred the night before, neither of them could recall what had happened. When John left the bathroom, Maxine fell again, this time hitting her head on the bathtub. He helped her up and brought her back to bed as she claimed to feel ill. Maxine remained in bed all day, and upon trying to get up several times, she continued to fall down, and her condition deteriorated. Despite Maxine's worsening condition the day before, she remained in bed but seemed to be doing better the next morning, so John went out to run some errands. When he arrived at home, her condition had plummeted yet again. He was unable to wake her, so he called their doctor to make an immediate house call. Upon the doctor's arrival, Maxine was still unconscious. They called an ambulance and she was taken to the hospital, where she died the following morning of brain injuries. John was immediately suspected by the police and charged with non-capital murder in relation to her death. The Crown prosecutor argued that John had assaulted Maxine, delivering at least 2 significant blows to her head, causing her massive brain swelling and fatal head injuries. An expert witness in the case was pathologist Dr. Michael Dietrich, who performed the autopsy on Ditchfield and concluded that her extensive brain damage was caused by a terrific blow to the head delivered with extreme force, and that it was unlikely that she would have sustained these injuries just by falling. Dr. Dietrich provided the Crown with photos of the bruising to present to the jury to support his findings. He found the cause of death to be circulatory and respiratory failure secondary to severe brain damage caused by blunt trauma to the head from a fist, foot, or very firm shoe. The Claydons had testified that Salmon and Ditchfield did argue a little bit that evening, however, it was not loud or prolonged. But Maxine's son Michael, who was 8 years old, testified that he had woken up to them screaming, and he had seen John hitting Maxine outside, an event that nobody else had witnessed nor heard about prior to his testimony. He also testified that he had seen John hit Maxine in the kitchen. His testimony was slightly doubted because from where he was sleeping, he could not have seen the area of the kitchen in which Maxine fell. On March 5, 1971, the jury found John not guilty of non-capital murder, but guilty of manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Salmon has consistently maintained his innocence from the moment it happened and still to this day. The defense's argument was that the head injuries were a result of a fall or series of falls. John Salmon appealed his conviction to the Ontario Court of Appeal, which was dismissed on November 10, 1972. John remained in prison until he was released on parole on July 26, 1974. Over Over 20 years later, John approached criminal defense lawyer and Innocence Canada senior counsel James Lockyer for help after being inspired by his success in helping Stephen Truscott become exonerated after his own wrongful conviction. Mr. Lockyer recruited 2 forensic pathologists and a forensic neuropathologist. The Crown later retained its own expert as well, a clinical neuropathologist. All 4 of the experts concluded that John did not kill Maxine, but she died of brain damage sustained in a series of falls. They agreed that the locations of her brain injuries were not consistent with being struck and disagreed with the original pathologist Dr. Dietrich that her injuries were sustained from a very forceful impact. Rather, the damage resulted from minimal impact. Mr. Lockyer and another lawyer, Marie Hanine, applied to the Supreme Court of Canada for an order requiring the Ontario Court of Appeal to reconsider the case, and the application was granted on October 25, 2012. On June 22, 2015, the Ontario Court of Appeal admitted the evidence absolving John, and his manslaughter conviction was quashed. At 75 years old, John Salmon's name was clear. Although he cannot get back the years that he lost, John and his wife, children, and grandchildren were satisfied that they could finally find some peace. In John's case, there were 3 factors in particular that led to his wrongful conviction. The first error made in the investigation was the use of flawed pathological evidence. Decades after Maxine's death, new techniques for detecting causes of brain injuries have emerged. Therefore, new evidence was available to support Salmon. Now, much more is known about head injuries and the types of impact that would cause them. If John had hit her, the damage in Maxine's brain would have been closer to the site of impact. However, her injuries were some distance away from the site of impact. This information was not available at the time of the trial and would have removed the basis for a criminal prosecution if it had been. It is notable that 5 years before Ditchfield's death, pathologists refined a method of determining whether a head injury was caused by a skull striking a stationary object or the stationary head being struck by a moving object, also called acceleration-deceleration injuries. It is thought that the original pathologist ignored this technique, however, it was still very new. Clay Powell, the lawyer who prosecuted Salmon back in 1971, now says that had the new evidence been available at the time, the case would have never even gone to trial. He also noted that he always had a nagging doubt about John's guilt and offered an apology if he had failed in his role of Crown Counsel. Justice Gouge, who published an inquiry into pediatric forensic pathology, commented on the importance of the reliability of forensic pathology opinions, emphasizing that it can lead to tragic outcomes. Most forensic pathology work in Ontario has been left to anatomical pathologists who are self-taught in forensic matters and have minimal training. It is also notable that Dr. Dietrich was a clinical, not a forensic pathologist. This means that he was trained to identify the causes of disease in living patients, not the cause of death through postmortem examination. It is also suspected that he may have used a thinking dirty approach, as he began the investigation thinking that the death was a homicide. A second factor leading to John's wrongful conviction was unreliable eyewitness testimony. The only witnesses to the events were the Clayton couple, who were both inebriated at the time, and Maxine's son Michael, who was only 8 years old. This made it extremely complicated to trust the credibility of their accounts. The competence of child witnesses has been a long-standing issue, beginning in 1893 when Canada enacted its first legislation on child witnesses, permitting them to testify even if they couldn't explain the nature and consequences of an oath, but only if they understood their duty to tell the truth. As of 2006, the test for competence became whether the child was able to understand and respond to the questions being asked. The primary concern with child witnesses is suggestibility. Repeated and misleading questions can distort the memory of any adult witness, let alone children, who are much more impressionable. When children are asked questions that they don't fully understand, they usually attempt to provide an answer based on the parts that they did understand, which can often lead to unresponsive or misleading answers. The testimony provided by the witnesses was also affected by hindsight bias and estimator variables. Hindsight bias was undoubtedly present in this case, as the pathologist gave his opinion of a beating to an impressionable jury and a grieving 8-year-old, and given the evidence they had at the time, it would have seemed obvious to anyone. The estimator variables in this case were the lighting during the event and the witness characteristics. As it was nighttime during the event in question, the lighting would have been dim, possibly hindering the memory of the witnesses who were already not entirely credible due to their age and intoxication. Police techniques also affected John's fate, shaping the minds of both the jury and Maxine's family. The police immediately suspected that John abused her and used tunnel vision against him. They committed prematurely to him as a suspect and did not give any thought to any other potential scenarios, refusing to consider that she may have fallen. It is likely that they just wanted a conviction because it was unbelievable that the extent of her injuries could have been caused by falling. Retrospective rationalization was also used, as the investigators had a few statements from Michael and images of the injuries, and constructed a linear narrative of how this so-called crime happened. It appeared to just make sense that he beat her and the child reportedly saw it happen. Maxine's family, specifically her kids who were there, are not convinced of John's innocence and do not feel as though justice has been served. As Kirk, Maxine's son, states, he knows what he did. In the near half-century since his parole release and exoneration, John has experienced many problems with reintegration and rebuilding his life. John stated that he preferred to not dwell on the frustration as he put in time working doubles in the prison kitchen and poured himself into his welding job after release. He moved to Aurelia after being released in 1974, knowing that his past would prevent him from a good quality of life in Woodstock. Since his release, he experienced a circle of redundancy, making it difficult to integrate back into society, and despite factual and now legal innocence, he is continually stigmatized. He met his current wife Margaret in 1979, and he was always open with her about his experience, and she was always accepting. She had been supportive throughout the process and was extremely relieved for the children and grandchildren to know, once and for all, that John is the man he is, not the man some people think he is. Not only has the stigma affected John, but also his family. His son Randy stated that he idolized his father, but watched him turn into an unhappy, emotionally remote man, and lost his own job that he had held for 30 years when the case reappeared in the headlines. John continues to carry the shame of a crime he didn't commit and reflects on the actions he should have taken at the time, stating, "She hit her head on the tub. That's when, looking back, I should have taken her to the hospital." After John Salmon's exoneration, he and his wife were looking forward to enjoying more peace in their retirement and for the rest of their years.